Hey there. Ready to dive into something fascinating today?
Always.
We are exploring Renovaré, and get this, they're all about helping people like you and me experience a more vibrant and fulfilling faith,
Yeah.
not just on Sundays, but in every aspect of life.
It's about bridging that gap we often feel between belief and how we actually live.
Right. Like we believe in God, we might even have a regular spiritual practice, but sometimes it still feels like something's missing.
And that's where Renovaré's approach to spiritual formation comes in. They're
Russ.
not just focused on being good Christians, but about actively cultivating a relationship with God that impacts every single part of our lives.
Okay, so let's unpack this whole spiritual formation thing a bit more. They have this really powerful quote on their website. We are eternal beings, but have lost sight of eternal living. What resonates with you about that statement?
I think it speaks to a universal human experience. We're wired for a connection with something larger than ourselves, yet we often get so caught up in the day-to-day that we lose sight of that deeper reality.
Yeah.
Renovare reminds us that we're not just physical beings going through the motions, but spiritual beings capable of experiencing a profound and lasting connection with the divine.
And they offer practical guidance for actually cultivating that connection, not just talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
One of the ways they do this is through what they call spiritual disciplines, but they're adamant that this isn't about checking boxes to earn points with God.
Absolutely not.
Mm-hmm.
Renovare sees these spiritual disciplines as tools for spiritual growth, not a checklist for divine approval.
Okay.
Think of them as practices that help us become more receptive to God's presence and guidance.
It's like building spiritual muscles.
Yeah.
We might not be great at all, 12 disciplines,
Mhm.
but even practicing a few can make a big difference. So let's dive into a few that stood out to me.
Yeah.
One that I found particularly interesting was meditation.
Okay.
For some people, meditation might sound a little too new agey,
Right.
but Renovaré emphasizes that Christian meditation is about connecting with God, not emptying your mind.
Exactly. They describe it as creating space for intentional connection with God, quieting the noise of the world so we can hear his voice speaking to our hearts.
I find that so refreshing, especially in our hyper-connected world,
Yeah.
Just finding a quiet place for even a few minutes each day, focusing on my breath and inviting God's presence into that stillness, that feels very doable and necessary.
It is a practice that's deeply rooted in Christian tradition, and it offers us a pathway to experience God's peace and presence in the midst of our busy lives.
And then there's fasting, which honestly, I'll admit, can feel a little intimidating.
Sure.
But again, they stress that this isn't about some extreme diet plan.
Not at all. Renovare views fasting as a way to intentionally deny ourselves something, food, social media, anything we tend to rely on to grow closer to God and understand ourselves better.
Huh.
It's not about deprivation for the sake of deprivation, but about creating space for deeper dependence on God.
So by removing something we depend on, we become more aware of our need for God. That makes a lot of sense.
And it's in that space of emptiness that we can become more attuned to his voice, allowing our desires to align with his will for our lives.
Now, there's one more discipline I want to touch on before we move on, and that's solitude. This one, I have to say, really challenges me.
Okay.
We live in a world that constantly demands our attention. So the idea of intentionally seeking solitude can feel almost counterintuitive.
I understand that.
Yeah.
But in a world that's always switched on, solitude offers a chance to reconnect with our own hearts and listen for God's voice. It's about carving out space for stillness and reflection amidst the noise and busyness, creating that sacred space where we can be fully present to God's presence within us.
It's like hitting the pause button on life for a little while,
Yeah.
so we can reconnect with ourselves and with God. Which I think is a perfect segue to the next piece of Renovaré's approach that I want to unpack their 6 streams.
Okay.
When I first came across this idea, I thought, okay, it might be getting a little too abstract for me.
Sure.
But as I dug in, I realized it's actually a really helpful way to visualize a balanced spiritual life.
It is a beautiful metaphor, isn't it? Renovaré uses these 6 streams to represent distinct but interconnected aspects of the Christian faith, drawing on the richness of various traditions to help us cultivate a more holistic and vibrant faith.
Okay, so walk us through these streams. What are we talking about here?
Well, one that I find particularly compelling is the contemplative tradition. Renovare describes it as the steady gaze of the soul upon the God who loves us. It's about cultivating a posture of attentiveness to God's presence in every moment.
Which connects back to what we were saying about meditation and solitude.
Right.
Those practices that help us slow down and create space for God.
Precisely. The contemplative tradition reminds us that those practices aren't just about checking things off a list, but about fostering a deeper, more abiding awareness of God's presence in our lives.
It's about shifting our focus from all the noise and distractions to that quiet space within where God resides. Which, let's be honest, isn't always easy in our fast-paced world.
And that's where the disciplines can be so helpful. They provide us with tools and practices for cultivating that inner stillness.
So we've got the contemplative tradition. What's another stream that stands out?
Another one that Renovaré emphasizes is the holiness tradition. Now, this one sometimes gets a bad rap, but they're careful to point out that it's not about being perfect or judgmental.
It's about aligning our hearts and actions with God's will, right? Living in a way that reflects God's character.
I love that they use the phrase to function well in life.
It's a great way to frame it, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's about becoming more and more like the people God created us to be, living out our faith in practical, down-to-earth ways.
And that doesn't mean we have to isolate ourselves from the world to pursue some unattainable standard of perfection.
Not at all. In fact, it's quite the opposite.
Mhm.
The holiness tradition calls us to engage with the world, but to do so in a way that reflects God's love and character. Which brings us to the social justice tradition. This one really stood out to me because it highlights that our faith shouldn't just be confined to our personal lives. It has implications for how we treat others and how we work for justice in the world.
Absolutely. Renovaré is very clear that our faith should compel us to action. They have this great quote in their materials: love of God makes love of neighbor possible.
I love that.
Okay.
It speaks to the heart of the social justice tradition,
Mm.
which is about recognizing the inherent dignity and worth of every human being and working to create a world where everyone has the opportunity to flourish. It's about letting it kind of like spill over into everything we do,
Yeah.
right? It's not just this compartmentalized thing.
Yeah, and that's where I think the real beauty of that six streams framework comes in. They're not separate compartments. They all kind of flow into and nourish one another.
Yeah. Oh, I love that image of the streams flowing into each other because it is this kind of interconnected thing.
Right.
Where it's like contemplation, holiness, justice, all of these different things are working together to help us live out, this vibrant faith.
Exactly. And what I find so compelling about Renovare's approach is that it's both comprehensive and accessible.
Mhm.
It acknowledges the richness and depth of the Christian tradition,
Mm.
but it also offers these really practical tools and guidance for anyone who's seeking to deepen their relationship with God. It's
Yeah.
like they're saying, this is a journey, not a destination. You don't have to have it all figured out. You just have to be willing to take the next step.
And to remember that we're not alone on the journey either.
Right.
Like we are part of this larger story,
That's right.
this community of faith that spans, centuries and continents.
Yeah.
And we can draw strength and wisdom from those who have gone before us. We've got the scriptures. We have the traditions of the church, and we have each other, to support and encourage us along the way.
Exactly. And that's what's so important about Renovare's emphasis on spiritual formation as an ongoing process, right? It's about continually opening ourselves to God's transforming presence, allowing him to shape us into the people he created us to be.
It's a process that takes time and intentionality, but like you said earlier, grace.
Right.
Like it's progress, not perfection.
Well said. It's about showing up authentically just as we are and allowing God to meet us in that place.
This has been such a rich conversation.
Yeah.
I feel like Renovare has given us so much to think about these disciplines, the six streams, and most importantly, just that invitation to kind of embark on this journey of spiritual growth.
Yeah.
As we wrap up, I'm left wondering, if you could ask God for one thing to help you experience more joy, peace, or purpose in your own life, what would it be? And how might these practices we've discussed today help you open yourself to that?
That's a beautiful question, and one I think we can all benefit from reflecting on. For me, it would be the grace to quiet the noise of the world and to listen more deeply for God's voice in my life, to cultivate that steady gaze of the soul that Renovaré talks about. I think the practices we've discussed today, from meditation and solitude to engaging in acts of justice and compassion, these are all pathways that can help us move towards that kind of deep listening and connection with the divine.
Absolutely. And on that note, I think that's a perfect place for us to kind of end this conversation today. So to all of you listening, we encourage you to take some time to reflect on your own journey. What is one thing that you can do today, this week, this month, to cultivate a more vibrant and fulfilling faith? Remember, it's a journey, not a destination. And as Renovaré reminds us, with God's grace, it's a journey worth taking